Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Many of you have heard me already address issues pertaining to IVF and, really the continued affront against life in the womb in our society and culture. Joining me to have a conversation about this, and in a particular way pertaining to embryo burial as a necessary part of parental grieving for children lost in the womb, is Rebecca Anderson, co-host of Life Talk Northwest on Sacred Heart Radio in Washington State. She also works there as a community outreach coordinator, and she volunteers with 40 Days for Life and is active in the pro-life movement. Rebecca, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm good today. Thank you, Marcus.
So I want to begin by asking you to share your story about witnessing an embryo burial. And according to what you shared with me, that greatly shaped a particular trajectory in your work in the pro-life movement.
Yeah, it really did. And I think until you really experience something, sometimes you don't really know the depth of the destruction of something. And so, I was actually blessed last year to go to an actual rite of commendation for embryonic children lost in IVF that was done in Minnesota. And because our archdiocese actually had given us permission to do embryonic burial through this ministry in Minnesota, and so I was just blessed to be there. So I went and I met the founder and was actually at the gravesite for it. But what really impacted me is that on the way to the cemetery, she asked me if I wanted to carry the box, which is where she had been gathering the embryonic remains of children. And I said yes, and then just the weight of holding that box with the remains of 123 embryonic children, it just shifted me. And it still impacts me. It's just like, this is so wrong. And so, so I'm just kind of sharing my story about it because people need to know the ramifications of IVF.
Share with us the sheer horrors, in terms of a cursory overview, the sheer horrors of the entire process. And I invite you to share this also because we're seeing a rise in many Catholics claiming the charity of the work of quote-unquote embryo adoption, which is nothing more than IVF guised in euphemistic terms.
Right. Well, I have to say, so really, I think as a church, backing up needs to do a better job in educating those that are struggling with infertility issues, that IVF does come with some very dark and I think very horrible things that we should not go down that route. But I can also see the desire for children, and that oftentimes is overridden by looking at the long-term ramifications of artificial reproductive technology, which is IVF. So just for me, it was realizing that 123 little tiny little human beings never even got a chance to be in their mother's wombs. And as doing pro-life work and being on the sidewalk, Marcus, I would have to stand on the sidewalk a long time to even encounter 123 women who were going into an abortion clinic to end the lives of their children. So it just the sheer number of what, I was holding in my hands radically shifted. In fact, in my head, as I was holding this box going to her car so we could take it to the cemetery, literally it was a scream of this has to stop. This has to stop. And more people need to know how devastating, IVF is. Again, at the expense of wanting a child, but the carnal damage, the carnage done through this process, it cannot be. You cannot rationally say that IVF is the way.
I couldn't agree more. And as my bride and I, everyone listening to this program knows my bride and I have encountered significant loss of children in the womb. And so firsthand, we know the great pain of first of all, losing children, but therefore our hearts break for this terrible industry of IVF and the commodification of children and life in the womb. But one of the things that you have written to me about, too, is the reality of embryo burial. And really, this is burial of a child that never came to full term. Can you please speak to that?
Sure. And so basically what it is, it's, there are different ways. In fact, if you really understand what IVF is, you would be just shocked and just in horror because, there are different ways in which an embryo meets its death in the IVF lab. There's actually 7 or 8. And so really this process, what happens to those children? What happens to those children that don't make it out of the lab and into a womb? And unfortunately, I think where also things get, why we are to this point is that families that go through IVF or even consider IVF, they don't have full consent truly of what's going on in the lab. And really, patients need to be clearly and fully informed that the process by which they hope to conceive children will also result in the death of some of those children. And I think even having that knowledge would probably stop many couples from going down that road, because then it would kind of wake them up of like, oh, yes, I have a child at the end, but how many children didn't make it and they died in the lab? I mean, like, they're your children. They're on your family tree, right?
Yeah.
It's just crazy that we've gotten to this point where we are commodifying the creation of children. And then also on another side note, I have, interviewed a young woman who was conceived via IVF, and she considers herself a survivor. So even those people, and they are intrinsically valuable because they are human beings, they also suffer the burden of this artificial technology because they know that they, had siblings that didn't make it. Either they were miscarried within the womb or they died in the lab. And that is a burden that we as humans should not be passing on to people.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, too, that the church has written quite a few things about the suspension of life in these IVF facilities and in these cryo chambers. We don't have a good moral solution other than we've created a moral conundrum unto ourselves, but embryo adoption and IVF is not the solution in itself.
No. And in fact, at that particular burial, I actually did talk to a family they were there because one of the embryos they had adopted did not make it out of the lab. And then I'm looking at a child who, started their contraception, they were conceived almost 2 decades before that. And this child was, under 2 years old. And even to wrap your mind around that was just like your origin story. It's not an adoption in what my mother decided or picked the family. There was no mother. There was no womb. There was no birth. There was no handing over. There was being left in a lab for decades. And praise God, not thawed and discarded. But yet there's still that burden that little tiny, beautiful child is going to have. That's part of their origin story. And, how do we walk with people that, started in that way? So again, seeing it firsthand and actually witnessing it, it was just like, well, more people need to know. We need to continue to talk about this in love, with mercy. But truly, embryonic burial to me is an extremely important corporal work of mercy, burying the dead. And how can our Catholic Church, do more of this? Maybe Catholic parish, maybe Catholic cemeteries take that on as their own ministry. We don't know the number of children that, are meeting their demise in the lab. Very few labs acknowledge the humanness, and this ministry that is now unfortunately folding, there were only 2 IVF labs that actually acknowledge the humanness of the embryonic child. And there are far more IVF labs that do not even give parents the opportunity to, bury those children that don't make it out of the IVF lab. So.
In fact, horrifyingly, the children are frequently classified as medical waste, and so their humanity is not even recognized. The other problem we have, Rebecca, that just very briefly I want to invite you to speak to, is that we're not doing a good enough job in the church as a whole to talk about the burial of embryonic children. People don't know that the resources exist, and they don't know where to find them.
Right, exactly. They don't. And again, this was one ministry. It had started in 2018. They were able to bury about 2,300 embryonic children. So this was one person, right? And it's a bigger deal. It's more than, not one person can do all of this, right? And so that's why I'm speaking and letting people know, like, where in your own parish, letting families know that there's this. But again, there's this great heartache as well, because you've got these children now, in cryo. We should not be freezing children, Marcus. Like, the fact that we even talk about this should really alarm everyone.
Yes. And it should strike all of our consciences to wake up and realize we are playing with powers far beyond our ken. Rebecca, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
My guest has been Rebecca Anderson, co-host of Life Talk Northwest on Sacred Heart Radio in Washington State. She is tremendously involved in the pro-life movement, and we've been talking about embryo burial and IVF and quote-unquote embryo adoption not being viable moral solutions. I'm Marcus Peter.